Okay, what I want to do here in this video is just go over a few of the basics in factoring. Your factoring quiz covered all the bases of factoring with 3 terms and 2 terms. The only thing that was not on your quiz was factoring by grouping, but there are other tutorial videos for that. I'm just going to go over a few questions here. You should not have your quiz in front of you, but you probably want to write these down and follow along with me. Hopefully it'll help to answer a few questions. I'll start with the very first question here. I have an x squared minus a 6x plus a 9. If I notice, the leading coefficient here is 1. There's nothing in front of that x squared. When you don't see anything in front of the x squared, that is the simplest form of factoring that we will work with. And it's simply asking what are two numbers that when I multiply them together, I get the third term, which in this situation is 9. But when I add those same two numbers together, I get the second term, which in this situation is a negative 6. So I want to know what are two numbers that when I multiply them I get a positive 9, but when I add them I get a negative 6. And those two numbers are a negative 3 and a negative 3. Because a negative 3 times a negative 3 is going to give me a positive 9, so we're good there. And a negative 3 plus a negative 3 is going to give me a negative 6, so we're okay there. So I'm simply writing two binomials, both with negative 3's. X minus 3 times an x minus 3. If you wrote it this way, as an x minus 3 squared, that's perfectly okay too. Either one of those are fine. Once again, easiest form of factoring that we will see. Let's go into number 2 then. Number 2, have a 3x squared minus a 8x plus a 4. Now if you notice here, there is something in front of that x squared. As soon as there's something in front of that x squared, it's not so easy to say what are numbers that multiply together to give me term 3, but add together to give me term 2. This becomes somewhat of a guess and check game. I first have to break down that first term. It's a 3x squared. And the only two things, since 3 is prime, I can multiply together to give me a 3x squared are 3x times an x. So I'm going to start there. 3x times an x. I know those has to be my first two terms, because if I were to distribute, 3x times an x gives me the 3x squared. Now I need to break down that 4. 4 has a handful of factors to it. I can have 4 times 1, or I can have 2 times 2. They're both going to give me 4. But if I look at this middle term here, the middle term is negative, meaning I cannot take any positive values and add them together to get a negative sum. It's not possible. So as opposed to going with a positive 1 and a positive 4, I'm going to go with a negative 1 times a negative 4. Because negative 1 times negative 4 still gives me a positive 4. But if I were to add those values, I can get a negative. I'm also going to go with a negative 2 times a negative 2. Because negative 2 times negative 2 is a positive 4, but I can add those two negatives to get the negative second term. Excellent. Now what I have to do is start plugging in values to see which ones work. Middle term is a mystery. I'm going to start with the minus 1 and the minus 4. And I've got to check that middle term to see if it works. Well, 3x times x is a 3x squared. 3x times a negative 4 is a negative 12x. Negative 1 times x is a negative x. And 1 times the negative 4 is a positive 4. If I combine those middle terms, a negative 12x minus an x is a negative 13x. That's not what I want. What I want is a negative 8. So I know that combination does not work. I'm going to try something different. I'm going to try the 3x with the minus 4 and then the x with the minus 1, because that does make a difference. I'm going to distribute those out and see if that works. 3x times x is a 3x squared. 3x times a negative 1 is a negative 3x. Negative 4 times a x is a negative 4x. And negative 4 times a negative 1 is a positive 4. Checking that middle term again, negative 3x minus a 4x gives me a negative 7x. That's not what I want. I need it to be a negative 8x. I know that doesn't work. Let's go on to my 2's. I'm going to try a 3x minus 2 times an x minus 2. Let's see if that one works. I take the 3x times the x is going to give me a 3x squared. The 3x times the negative 2 will give me a negative 6x. Negative 2 times an x is going to give me a negative 2x. And a negative 2 times a negative 2 will give me the positive 4. Checking that middle term. A negative 6x minus a 2x does give me a negative 8x. We have found our solution. It's right here. Our answer then is 3x minus 2 times an x minus 2. These types of questions can get a little messy. As I talked about in class, many of you are not going to have to sit here and list out all these combinations. You begin to develop patterns, kind of like riding a bike. You don't have to think about it, it just kind of happens. It becomes second nature that you eventually start choosing numbers that just work. But if you're not at that point, listing out these combinations is your only option for figuring out what that middle term is. Like I said, it's a guess and check game. Some of these take a little longer than others. I'll stop this video here. Those are the two earlier forms of factoring, one which has a leading coefficient of 1, the other which has a leading coefficient that's not 1. In the next video, we'll take a look at some of these down at the bottom in which I maybe only have 2 terms, or I can take out a greatest common factor before I begin to factor.